The ocean never forgets what we choose to abandon beneath its surface. On a moonless night in 1979, somewhere between the coordinates of memory and myth, a woman wearing an emerald necklace stood on the upper deck of a luxury cruise liner and vanished into darkness. Her name was Cordelia Hargrove, and for 25 years the sea kept her secret locked away in salt and silence. But secrets, like bodies, have a way of floating back to the surface. The story begins not with her disappearance, but with what came after. A quarter century later, in the summer of 2004, a pair of recreational divers descended into the cerulean waters off the coast of Whitehaven Point, a sleepy maritime town that had built its economy on shipwrecks and the tourists who came to photograph them. The divers were searching for remnants of a colonial-era vessel rumored to rest 40 feet below, its wooden ribs picked clean by time and tide. What they found instead was a necklace, not corroded, not encrusted with barnacles or dulled by decades underwater. The emerald at its center still caught the filtered sunlight that penetrated the depths, refracting green fire through the gloom. The gold chain remained intact, delicate yet untarnished, as if it had been placed there yesterday rather than a generation ago. One of the divers, a man named Garrett Finch who taught marine biology at the local university, recognized the piece immediately, not because he had seen it before, but because he had heard about it. Everyone in Whitehaven Point over a certain age had heard about it. The necklace belonged to Cordelia Hargrove, the socialite who had disappeared from the Meridian Dream cruise ship in the autumn of 1979. The discovery sparked something that had long been dormant. Questions that had been filed away, accepted as unanswerable, suddenly demanded to be asked again. And so the story of Cordelia Hargrove, which had faded into the texture of local legend, returned with the insistence of an unfinished melody. To understand what happened on that October night aboard the Meridian Dream, one must first understand who Cordelia was before she became a mystery. She was born in 1946 to a family whose wealth was old enough to be respectable but recent enough to still enjoy spending. Her father, Edmund Hargrove, had made his fortune in textiles during the post-war boom, transforming a modest mill operation into a regional empire. Her mother, Vivienne, came from a lineage of shipping magnates, whose names were engraved on memorial plaques in half the churches along the eastern seaboard. Cordelia grew up in Ashmont, a city known for its sprawling estates and autumn horse races, where society pages mattered more than obituaries and charity galas served as battlegrounds for status. She attended the right schools, summered at the right beaches, and married the right man at 23 in a ceremony that made the papers as far south as Millbrook. Her husband was Preston Valemont, an attorney whose family name opened doors that even money sometimes couldn't. They were, by all appearances, the perfect couple. Photographs from the early years of their marriage show them at gallery openings, theater premieres, and yacht club regattas. Cordelia wore pearls and silk scarves. Preston wore confidence like a second skin. But perfection, especially the kind performed for cameras, rarely survives scrutiny. By the mid-70s, those who knew them well began to notice fissures. Preston spent increasing amounts of time away on business. Cordelia threw herself into charity work with an intensity that seemed less like passion and more like escape. They still appeared together at important events, still smiled for photographers, but those who looked closely could see the distance between them even when they stood side by side. The emerald necklace had been a gift from Preston on their 10th anniversary. He presented it to her at a dinner party attended by 60 of their closest acquaintances, making a public spectacle of devotion. Cordelia had worn it often after that, perhaps because she loved it, or perhaps because not wearing it would have invited questions. In October of 1979, the Hargroves booked passage on the Meridian Dream, a mid-sized cruise liner that catered to the upper middle class and those who aspired to join them. The vessel offered a week-long journey through the southern maritime routes, stopping at ports known for duty-free shopping and colonial architecture. It was the sort of trip that appeared frequently in the social calendars of people like the Hargroves, a pleasant diversion that required neither too much intimacy nor too much effort. They boarded on a Saturday afternoon in Westport Harbor, their luggage handled by porters who knew better than to expect eye contact along with their tips. Cordelia wore the emerald necklace. Several passengers would later remember this detail, would remember how the stone caught the afternoon light as she ascended the gangway. The ship departed at sunset, sliding out of harbor with the smooth inevitability of something that had made this journey 1,000 times before. 532 passengers stood along the rails, waving to no one in particular, performing the ritual farewell that cruise departures demanded. For the first 3 days, nothing remarkable occurred. The Hargroves dined at the captain's table on the second night, made small talk with other passengers, and attended a classical music performance in the main lounge. Staff members who served them noticed what couples often reveal without meaning to. Preston and Cordelia occupied their shared spaces like polite strangers, observing the forms of couplehood without its substance. On the 4th day, the ship docked at Coral Haven, a port town whose primary industry was separating tourists from their money in the most pleasant way possible. The Hargroves disembarked separately. Preston joined a fishing excursion. Cordelia browsed the markets alone, purchasing a watercolor painting from a street artist and a box of imported chocolates that she would never eat. That evening, there was a deck party. The cruise line organized these events twice per voyage, weather permitting. String lights were hung along the railings. A band played standards from the 40s and 50s. Champagne flowed with the kind of abundance that made people forget they were paying for it indirectly. Cordelia attended wearing a white dress and the emerald necklace. Preston arrived late, already 3 drinks past sober, his tie loosened, and his charm wearing thin. Several witnesses would later recall seeing them together near the stern of the ship, standing apart from the main festivities where the music grew faint and the darkness pressed closer. They were arguing. A woman named Iris Pemberton, who had befriended Cordelia during a morning yoga class on the 2nd day, noticed them first. She couldn't hear the words, but she recognized the body language of a marriage unraveling in public, Preston leaning in too close, Cordelia turning away. His hand on her arm, not gently. Iris considered intervening but didn't. This would haunt her for years. Another passenger, a retired schoolteacher named Howard Beach, saw them as well. He was standing at the rail some distance away, smoking a pipe and enjoying the rare solitude the party afforded him. He watched Preston gesture sharply, watched Cordelia shake her head, watched the whole scene play out with the awkward fascination of someone witnessing something they shouldn't. Then Preston turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd near the bar. Cordelia remained at the stern, one hand on the railing, her face turned toward the black immensity of the ocean. Howard looked away. When he looked back, perhaps 30 seconds later, she was gone. He assumed she had simply walked to another part of the deck. It didn't occur to him to be concerned. Not then. The party continued until midnight. The band played their final song, a melancholy arrangement that seemed designed to send people off to bed with pleasant nostalgia. Passengers drifted toward their cabins, slightly drunk and thoroughly entertained. It wasn't until the following morning that anyone realized Cordelia Hargrove was missing. Preston reported her absence to the ship's security officer at 8 in the morning, claiming he had assumed she'd spent the night with a friend after their argument. He seemed embarrassed rather than worried, a husband accustomed to giving his wife space and expecting her to return. The security officer, a former police detective named Malcolm Cross, began a methodical search. Crew members checked every public space, every deck, every lounge and dining area. They knocked on cabin doors. They made announcements over the intercom, carefully worded to avoid panic. Cordelia was nowhere on the ship. Malcolm interviewed the Hargroves' cabin steward, who confirmed that their bed had not been slept in. He interviewed passengers who had attended the deck party, slowly piecing together a timeline. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Cordelia had been at the stern around 11:15. Several had seen her arguing with Preston. No one could definitively say they had seen her after 11:30. When Malcolm questioned Preston more thoroughly, the attorney's demeanor shifted from embarrassed to defensive. Yes, they had argued. No, it wasn't serious. Just the usual tensions that arose between spouses on vacation. She had been upset about something trivial. He couldn't even remember what. He had walked away to give her space, assuming she would calm down and find him later. But there was something in the way Preston told the story, something in the pauses between his words, that made Malcolm's instincts whisper warnings he couldn't yet articulate. The ship's captain made the decision to turn around, retracing their route in case Cordelia had somehow fallen overboard. Coast Guard vessels were notified. Search planes were dispatched. For 3 days, crews scanned the water, looking for any sign of a woman in a white dress with an emerald necklace. They found nothing. The prevailing theory, the one that emerged quickly and hardened into accepted fact, was that Cordelia had fallen overboard accidentally. Perhaps she had been leaning over the rail, lost her balance, succumbed to a moment of vertigo or carelessness. The ocean at night was unforgiving. A person could disappear into it with barely a splash, could be swallowed so completely that even screams wouldn't carry far enough to matter. It was tragic, it was unfortunate, but it was, the authorities concluded, an accident. Preston returned to Ashmont alone. He gave a single interview to the local newspaper, his face arranged into appropriate grief, his words carefully chosen. He spoke of his beloved wife's adventurous spirit, her love of the ocean, the terrible randomness of fate. He established a scholarship in her name. He attended a memorial service where her favorite music was played, and people shared stories that made her sound like a woman none of them had actually known very well. And then, as time does, life moved forward. Preston eventually remarried to a woman 15 years younger who had never met Cordelia. The Hargrove estate was settled. The story became an anecdote, then a rumor, then a ghost story that locals told tourists on slow afternoons. But some people never stopped wondering. Iris Pemberton, who had watched the argument and done nothing, carried her guilt like a stone. Howard Beach, the retired teacher who had seen Cordelia alone at the rail, remained convinced there was more to the story than anyone wanted to admit. And Malcolm Cross, the security officer who had conducted the investigation, kept his file on the case long after the cruise line would have preferred him to destroy it. They didn't know what had really happened. But they knew, in the way that people sometimes know things without evidence, that accident was too simple an explanation for Cordelia Hargrove's disappearance. The ocean kept its secrets. The years passed. And then, on a bright summer morning in 2004, a marine biologist named Garrett Finch surfaced holding an emerald necklace that shouldn't have existed anymore. And suddenly the past was demanding to be reopened. The necklace arrived at the Whitehaven Point police station on a Tuesday afternoon, sealed in an evidence bag that bore the salty residue of its underwater discovery. Detective Sarah Chen held it up to the fluorescent lights of her office, watching how the emerald caught and scattered the artificial glow, and felt the weight of 25 years pressing against her chest. She had been 7 years old when Cordelia Hargrove disappeared. She remembered her mother talking about it over breakfast, remembered the hushed tones adults used when discussing tragedies they didn't want children to fully understand. Now, at 32, with 6 years on the force and a promotion to detective that still felt new, Sarah found herself staring at a piece of jewelry that had somehow survived a quarter century beneath the waves, looking as pristine as the day it vanished. The preservation alone was remarkable. Marine archaeologists from the university examined the piece and confirmed what seemed impossible. The salt water should have corroded the metal, tarnished the gold, dulled the stone. Instead, the necklace appeared untouched by time, as if it had been protected somehow, kept in a pocket of ocean that operated under different rules than the rest of the sea. One specialist suggested it might have been trapped in silt shortly after entering the water, creating an anaerobic environment that prevented oxidation. Another theorized about the specific mineral composition of the seabed in that location. But their scientific explanations couldn't quite mask their bewilderment. The necklace was an anomaly, and anomalies in cold cases always meant something. Sarah pulled the original investigation file from archives, blowing dust off a manila folder that hadn't been opened in over a decade. The paperwork was extensive. Malcolm Cross had been thorough, but reading through his reports, she began to see the patterns of an investigation that had been guided toward a predetermined conclusion from the beginning. The cruise line had wanted it resolved quickly. Accidents were unfortunate but manageable. Mysteries were bad for business. Anything suggesting foul play would have meant lawsuits, insurance complications, and publicity that could sink a company's reputation as effectively as an iceberg. So the evidence had been arranged, consciously or not, into a narrative of tragic misfortune. Woman argues with husband. Woman drinks champagne. Woman leans too far over railing. Woman falls. Ocean claims another victim. Case closed with sympathy and a discreet settlement to prevent the widower from pursuing legal action. But Malcolm's notes contained doubts he had apparently been unable to voice officially. Question marks appeared in the margins. Witness statements were underlined multiple times. And there, tucked into the back of the folder, Sarah found a handwritten memo that Malcolm had never filed. The memo was dated 3 weeks after Cordelia's disappearance. In it, Malcolm outlined inconsistencies he had noticed but couldn't prove. Preston Hargrove's timeline had small gaps, periods of 5 or 10 minutes where no one could confirm his location. A cabin steward reported hearing raised voices from the Hargrove suite earlier in the day, before the party, something Preston had never mentioned. And several passengers noted that Preston had seemed remarkably composed after his wife's disappearance, showing appropriate concern when questioned but little genuine distress. The memo ended with a single sentence that made Sarah's pulse quicken. Sarah looked up Malcolm Cross. He had left the cruise line's employment 6 months after Cordelia's disappearance, and returned to police work in a small coastal town 3 hours north of Whitehaven Point. He was 71 now, officially retired, but when Sarah called the number listed in the public records database, he answered on the second ring. "I've been waiting for this call for 25 years, Malcolm said, his voice still carrying the authority of someone accustomed to asking difficult questions. They met at a diner halfway between their two towns, one of those establishments that seemed frozen in 1985, with vinyl booths and a jukebox that probably still worked. Malcolm arrived first, a tall man whose frame had thinned with age but whose eyes remained sharp and skeptical. He brought his own file, a duplicate of the official records supplemented with notes he had continued making long after anyone paid him to care. Over coffee that tasted like it had been brewed the previous day, Malcolm walked Sarah through what he had always believed but could never prove. Preston Hargrove killed his wife, Malcolm said, with the certainty of someone who had lived with the knowledge for decades. He explained how Preston had controlled the narrative from the beginning. As an attorney, he understood investigations, knew which questions would be asked and how to shape his answers. He had expressed concern without panic, grief without breakdown, cooperation without quite providing anything useful. He reported her missing at 8 in the morning, Malcolm continued, but their cabin steward confirmed he had seen Preston alone, walking the deck at 6:30. Two crew members saw him in the business center at 7:15, fully dressed, composed, making phone calls. Sarah made notes, though she suspected she would remember every word without them. But there was no physical evidence. "That's the beauty of the ocean," Malcolm said, and there was bitterness in his tone. "It's the perfect crime scene because it destroys the evidence. You push someone overboard in the dark, they disappear. Current takes the body." "Except now you have the necklace," Malcolm agreed, and for the first time in their conversation he smiled. "And that changes everything, doesn't it?" The discovery generated media attention that spread beyond Whitehaven Point. Regional news stations picked up the story, framing it as a romantic mystery, the kind of cold case that captured public imagination, because it involved wealth and beauty and the sea. Reporters descended on the town, interviewing locals who remembered Cordelia, filming stand-ups with the harbor in the background. Preston Valemont, now 75 and living in a gated community 2 states away, declined all interview requests. His attorney released a statement expressing surprise at the discovery and hoped that it might provide closure regarding the tragic accident that had taken his former wife's life. The statement was 3 sentences long and communicated nothing while sounding appropriately mournful. But the media attention accomplished what official channels might not have. It brought people forward, witnesses who had kept quiet for decades, convinced their observations weren't important, suddenly felt permission to speak. A woman named Dorothy Marsh called the tip line Sarah had established. Dorothy had been a cocktail waitress on the Meridian Dream in 1979, working the deck party the night Cordelia disappeared. She was 68 now, retired and living with her daughter, but her memory of that night remained crystalline. "I served them both that evening," Dorothy told Sarah over the phone. "Mrs. Hargrove ordered champagne, Mr. Hargrove was drinking scotch. I remember because he was rude about it, said I had brought him the wrong brand even though I hadn't." Right around 11:25, he made a point of checking his watch and commenting on it, said something about how late it was getting. Another call came from Howard Beach, the retired schoolteacher who had witnessed the argument. He was 84 now, living in an assisted care facility, but his mind remained sharp even if his body had weakened. "He thought about that night every day for 25 years, Howard told Sarah when she visited him. "I saw her standing alone at the rail after he left. She was crying. Easily, it was dark back there, away from the party lights." Sarah reached across and touched his weathered hand. The most significant call came from someone Sarah hadn't expected. Iris Pemberton, the woman who had befriended Cordelia during the cruise, contacted the tip line from a retirement community in Arizona. She was 76, a widow, and she had carried her guilt about that night like a stone in her chest for a quarter-century. "I should have done something," Iris said, and Sarah could hear tears in her voice. "I saw them arguing, saw how aggressive he was being. Cordelia had confided in me earlier that day, told me she was planning to file for divorce when they returned home. She had discovered Preston was having an affair, had been for years. More than that, she had hired a private investigator and found out he had been embezzling from her family trust. She had evidence, paperwork." "No," the word came out as barely more than a whisper. "Preston cornered me the day after she disappeared, before the ship returned to port. He knew Cordelia and I had been friendly. He told me very calmly that if I said anything that complicated the situation, he would make sure my husband's construction company lost every major contract it depended on." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling anger rise in her throat. This was the evidence Malcolm had needed, the motive that transformed an accident into murder. The necklace gave us a reason to reopen the case. Building a case against Preston Hargrove proved more difficult than Sarah anticipated. The district attorney, a cautious man named Robert Brennan who had political ambitions that required maintaining a high conviction rate, was reluctant to pursue charges based on decades-old testimony and a piece of jewelry. "Everything you have is circumstantial," Robert told Sarah in his office, which overlooked the town square where protesters occasionally gathered to demand justice for various causes. "He had motive," Sarah argued. "Cordelia was about to expose his affair and his embezzlement." "Consistent with isn't the same as proof of." A defense attorney would shred this case, and Preston Hargrove has enough money to hire the best defense attorneys available. Robert leaned back in his chair, and for a moment his political mask slipped enough to show the frustration beneath. "Not saying we drop it, I'm saying we need more." The university agreed to fund a more extensive dive operation. Garrett Finch, the marine biologist who had discovered the necklace, led a team of 6 divers equipped with sonar mapping equipment and underwater cameras. They spent 2 weeks methodically searching a square mile of ocean floor, working in grids, documenting everything they found. What emerged was a portrait of the seabed as a museum of human carelessness. They found debris from dozens of ships, bottles and cans and fishing equipment, anchors and chains, and the skeletal remains of a small boat that had probably sunk during a storm decades ago. But they also found something else. 30 feet from where the necklace had been discovered, buried under 8 inches of silt, the divers uncovered a leather handbag. The salt water had damaged it severely, but enough remained intact to identify it as expensive, the kind of accessory a woman like Cordelia Hargrove would have carried. Inside, they found the dissolved remains of what might have been papers, and a waterlogged passport holder that still contained a plastic card bearing Cordelia's name. The discovery location was significant. Marine current analysis showed that objects dropped from the Meridian Dream's stern would have drifted in a specific pattern based on tides and underwater topography. The necklace and handbag were found exactly where computer models predicted they would be if they had entered the water on the night of October 12, 1979, between 11 and midnight. But there was more. The handbag contained something else, something that had been protected by multiple layers of leather and plastic. A small recording device, the kind popular in the late 70s for people who wanted to dictate notes or letters. The technology was primitive by modern standards, a cassette tape mechanism that had corroded beyond function. The forensics lab spent 3 weeks carefully extracting and preserving the tape. Audio restoration specialists used techniques developed for recovering sound from damaged historical recordings. What they retrieved was fragmentary, degraded by water and time, but enough remained to be intelligible. It was Cordelia's voice. Sarah listened to the recording in a sound-insulated room at the forensics lab, headphones pressed against her ears, barely breathing as the dead woman spoke. The quality was poor, the words sometimes obscured by static and gaps where the tape had deteriorated, but the emotion was unmistakable fear. Anger, determination. This is Cordelia Hargrove recording this on October 12, 1979. If you are hearing this, something has happened to me. Preston knows I discovered his theft. He knows I have evidence. He has been threatening me subtly at first, then more directly. Today he told me that accidents happen on cruise ships, that people fall overboard, that the ocean keeps secrets. I am afraid of my husband. I am afraid of what he might do. I have copies of the financial documents proving he embezzled nearly $2 million from my family trust. There was a pause, the sound of waves in the background, suggesting she had recorded this outside. I'm going to the party tonight. I'm going to pretend everything is normal. Tomorrow when we dock, I'm leaving him. I'm taking the evidence to the authorities. I'm taking my life back. But I needed to record this just in case Preston decides he can't let me leave. I'm carrying this tape in my handbag. I'm wearing the necklace he gave me, the one he used to buy my silence after I discovered his first affair. If something happens to me, if I disappear, I want people to know it wasn't an accident. Preston Hargrove is dangerous." The recording ended with a click, followed by the hiss of blank tape. Sarah removed the headphones with shaking hands. After 25 years, Cordelia Hargrove had finally testified against her husband. The arrest came on a Thursday morning. Sarah made the drive herself, accompanied by 2 federal agents since the crime had occurred in international waters, technically under maritime law jurisdiction. Preston's gated community tried to delay them at the entrance, but legal authority trumped residential security. Preston answered his door in golf clothes, a man who had aged into comfortable affluence, his silver hair carefully styled, his posture still carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. That confidence flickered when he saw the badges. He didn't resist. He didn't protest his innocence or demand his lawyer, not immediately. For just a moment, something crossed his face that might have been relief, as if he had been waiting 25 years for this knock on his door, as if carrying the secret had been more exhausting than he would ever admit. But the moment passed. His attorney's training reasserted itself. "That's fine," Sarah replied, gesturing for the agents to proceed with handcuffing. "But you should know we have your wife's testimony. She recorded it the night you killed her." For the first time in 25 years, Preston Hargrove had nothing to say. The trial took place the following spring, in a courthouse that had to install additional seating to accommodate the media and public interest. Preston hired a defense team that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, attorneys who argued that the recording was inadmissible, that the evidence was circumstantial, that the passage of time made a fair trial impossible. But juries respond to stories, and Cordelia's story, told through her own voice and corroborated by witnesses who had finally found the courage to speak, was compelling. The prosecution presented timeline analysis, expert testimony about ocean currents, and demonstration of how Preston had methodically established an alibi while murdering his wife. Malcolm Cross, now 72, testified about the investigation he had been prevented from conducting properly. Iris Pemberton, crying openly, described Preston's threats. Howard Beach, wheeled into the courtroom in a wheelchair, explained what he had seen that night and how he had blamed himself for decades. The verdict came after 3 days of deliberation: guilty. Preston showed no reaction when the word was pronounced, but Sarah, watching from the gallery, saw something in his eyes that might have been the last remnant of the man who had once believed he was clever enough to commit the perfect crime. At 76 years old, Preston Valemont was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. He would die behind bars, just as Cordelia had died in the ocean that night, alone and afraid. After the trial, Sarah returned to Whitehaven Point and stood at the harbor where the Meridian Dream had once docked. The cruise ship itself had been decommissioned years ago, sold for scrap, its hull cut apart and melted down. But the ocean remained, vast and indifferent, keeping whatever other secrets it had been trusted to hold. Garrett Finch, the diver who had started everything by reaching into the silt and pulling out an emerald necklace, joined her there. They watched the water together in comfortable silence. "Do you think she knew it would work?" Garrett finally asked, recording that message, putting it in her handbag. Sarah considered the question, thinking about a woman who had faced her own mortality with enough presence of mind to create insurance against being forgotten. "I think she hoped," Sarah said. The necklace was eventually donated to a museum dedicated to maritime history and unsolved mysteries. It sat in a climate-controlled case, the emerald still catching light, still beautiful, still refusing to show the marks of time and tragedy. A small placard told Cordelia's story, ensuring that visitors would know she was more than a footnote in local legend, more than a cautionary tale about accidents at sea. She was a woman who had fought back, even as she died. a woman who had made sure her voice would outlast the man who tried to silence it forever. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the museum was empty and the light hit the glass case at exactly the right angle, staff members swore they could almost see her reflection in the emerald's depths, a woman in a white dress, finally at peace. Malcolm Cross died 3 months after the verdict. He passed peacefully in his sleep, in the same coastal house where he had spent his retirement reviewing case files he was no longer paid to consider. His daughter found him in his armchair, the Cordelia Hargrove file open on his lap, a faint smile on his weathered face. At the funeral, Sarah Chen stood in the back row and understood that some people carry their cases like crosses, bearing them until justice finally allows them to rest. The prosecutor, Robert Brennan, gave a eulogy that surprised everyone who knew his political ambitions. He spoke not of convictions or career achievements, but of a phone call Malcolm had made to him 2 weeks before the trial, when Robert had still been considering whether to pursue charges. "He told me something I'll never forget," Robert said, his voice carrying across the small chapel. "He said that justice delayed isn't always justice denied. Sometimes the delay is necessary, not because we lack the will to act, but because the truth needs time to surface. Like bodies in water," he said, "the truth has its own buoyancy. It will rise when conditions are right." Sarah thought about those words often in the weeks that followed. The trial had been public, the conviction satisfying, but the aftermath brought complications she hadn't anticipated. Preston's defense team filed appeals, arguing everything from procedural errors to the admissibility of evidence recovered from the ocean floor. Each motion required response. Each challenge demanded her attention and energy. But more than that, the case had opened something in Whitehaven Point, a collective reckoning with the way the town had accepted and absorbed the original narrative. For 25 years, Cordelia's death had been local folklore, a tragic accident that people mentioned when telling tourists about the dangers of the sea. Now, confronted with evidence of murder and conspiracy, the town had to reconcile its casual acceptance with the horror of what had actually happened. Some people responded with anger, directing their rage at Preston or the cruise line or the investigators who had closed the case prematurely. Others retreated into denial, suggesting that the new evidence was somehow fabricated or misinterpreted. But most experienced something more complicated, an uncomfortable awareness of how easily truth can be buried when institutions prioritize convenience over justice. The museum where Cordelia's necklace was displayed became an unexpected pilgrimage site. People came from across the country to see it, drawn by the media coverage and the story's almost mythic dimensions. They stood before the glass case in silence, reading the placard, studying the emerald that had somehow survived when its owner could not. The museum's curator, a woman named Patricia Holloway who had spent her career preserving maritime history, told Sarah that visitors often left flowers. Small bouquets appeared regularly outside the display, accompanied by notes written in careful handwriting. Patricia collected these notes, storing them in acid-free folders, preserving them as she would any historical document. "They matter," she explained to Sarah during one of their conversations. "They're evidence of how people respond when they encounter courage." Sarah visited the display herself on a Wednesday afternoon, when the museum was nearly empty. She stood before the necklace for a long time, watching how the emerald caught the overhead lights, refracting green fire across the glass. It was beautiful, she thought, but its beauty was complicated now, weighted with knowledge of what it had witnessed. Sarah turned to find an elderly woman standing next to her, leaning slightly on a carved wooden cane. She was perhaps 80, dressed in clothing that suggested both money and taste, her white hair arranged in a style that had probably been fashionable decades ago and had never been updated. "I am," Sarah confirmed. "I'm Victoria Hargrove," the woman said, and Sarah felt recognition snap into place. Cordelia's younger sister. We weren't close, not in the way sisters should be. Different lives, different choices. They stood together in silence for a moment, two women regarding a piece of jewelry that had become something more than decoration, something closer to a memorial. I wanted to thank you, Victoria finally said, for not letting her disappear completely. No, Victoria's voice was firm despite her age. You did more than that. Your job would have been reviewing the file and agreeing with the original conclusion. Sarah felt emotion tighten her throat. Your sister did the hard part, she left evidence. She always was the brave one, Victoria said, and now there were tears on her weathered cheeks. I admired her for it, even when I didn't understand her choices. She married Preston despite our parents' concerns. She stayed with him longer than anyone expected. But when she finally decided to leave, to expose what he'd done, she didn't hesitate. I wish I had told her I was proud of her. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison. Victoria nodded slowly. Good, not because I believe in vengeance, but because some actions require consequences. He took my sister's life and then tried to erase her memory. After Victoria left, Sarah remained alone with the necklace. She thought about all the lives that had intersected with this case, all the people who had carried pieces of Cordelia's story for 25 years without knowing how they would eventually fit together. Malcolm with his suppressed investigation, Iris with her coerced silence, Howard with his guilty memories, Garrett with his accidental discovery. Each of them had held a fragment of truth, and only time and circumstance had finally allowed those fragments to form a complete picture. The legal aftermath continued for another year. Preston's attorneys exhausted every appeal, challenging everything from the chain of custody for the recovered evidence to the emotional impact statements that had influenced the jury. Each challenge failed. The recording of Cordelia's voice, authenticated by multiple experts and corroborated by witness testimony, was ruled admissible. The circumstantial evidence, when considered collectively, established guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Preston gave a single interview from prison, carefully orchestrated by his legal team, obviously intended to rehabilitate his public image while preserving his appeal options. The journalist asked him directly if he had killed his wife. I loved Cordelia, Preston said, and his performance was nearly convincing. What happened to her was a tragedy that I've lived with every day for 25 years. The jury reached their conclusion based on the evidence presented to them. It was a masterful non-answer, the kind of response an experienced attorney would craft to avoid admission while projecting reasonableness. But Sarah, watching the interview from her office, saw something beneath the careful words. Exhaustion, the toll of maintaining a lie for a quarter century, of performing innocence while knowing the truth, had carved lines into Preston's face that no amount of legal maneuvering could erase. The interview generated predictable controversy. Some viewers believed him, wanted to believe him, because the alternative required accepting that a man could murder his wife and successfully hide it for decades. Others saw through the performance, recognized the careful language and strategic emotion as manipulation, but the interview accomplished something Preston hadn't intended. It brought forward one final witness, someone whose testimony hadn't been needed for the conviction, but who added a crucial detail to understanding what had happened that night. His name was Marcus Webb, and in 1979 he had been a junior crew member on the Meridian Dream, responsible for routine maintenance and safety inspections. He was 68 now, living on a fixed income in a small apartment, working part-time at a hardware store to supplement his Social Security. He had watched Preston's interview and felt something break inside him, the final barrier of silence he had maintained since that October night. Marcus called Sarah directly, his voice shaking as he explained what he had seen. On the night Cordelia disappeared, Marcus had been on a lower deck, checking door seals and ensuring emergency equipment was properly secured. Around 11:30, he had heard sounds above him, on the upper deck near the stern where passengers weren't supposed to be after dark, footsteps, then voices, a man and woman arguing though he couldn't make out the words, then a scream, brief and sharp, cut off suddenly, then silence. Marcus had been young, scared of losing his job, undocumented in a country that could have deported him for any violation. When security interviewed crew members the next day, he had said nothing, convinced that whatever he had heard wasn't his business, that speaking up would only bring trouble he couldn't afford. He carried that scream for 45 years, Marcus told Sarah, and she could hear tears in his voice. Every night before I sleep, I hear it. Every morning when I wake up, I remember that I did nothing. I told myself it wasn't my fault, that I had no way of knowing what was happening, but I knew. Sarah took his statement officially, though it couldn't change the verdict that had already been rendered. But it mattered for the historical record, for the complete accounting of what had happened. And it mattered for Marcus, who needed to finally speak the truth he had swallowed for so long. "Does it help?" he asked Sarah when the interview was finished. Sarah thought about Malcolm and Iris and Howard and all the others who had carried their pieces of this story. "It doesn't erase what happened," she said carefully, "but it returns your voice to you." The second anniversary of the necklace's discovery fell on a Tuesday in late summer. The university organized a symposium about cold cases and the intersection of forensic science and historical investigation. Sarah was invited to speak, along with Garrett and several of the experts who had worked on evidence recovery and analysis. The auditorium was full, mostly students and academics, but also journalists and true crime enthusiasts, and people from Whitehaven Point who had followed the case from discovery to conviction. Sarah stood at the podium and looked out at all those faces, all those people who had been drawn to this story for their own reasons. "Cordelia Hargrove has been dead for 46 years, Sarah began. For 46 years, her husband lived as a free man, protected by the assumption that accidents happen, and the ocean keeps secrets. For 46 years, people who knew the truth stayed silent, frightened or intimidated or convinced that speaking wouldn't matter." She paused, letting the silence stretch across the auditorium. "This case taught me something about time and truth. We talk about justice delayed being justice denied, and often that's accurate. But sometimes delay isn't denial. Sometimes the truth needs time to surface, needs the right conditions and the right people and the right moment. Cordelia's truth waited 25 years. That's tragic." After the symposium, people approached Sarah with questions and comments. One young woman, probably a college student, asked something that stayed with Sarah long after the evening ended. Sarah considered the question carefully. "I think she hoped." Hope and belief aren't the same thing. Belief is certainty. Hope is possibility. Cordelia didn't know if anyone would find her message, but she hoped. She trusted that possibility enough to act on it, even knowing she might not survive the night. "I hope you're never in that situation," Sarah replied gently. 3 years after the conviction, Preston Valemont died in prison. Heart failure, quick and relatively painless, more mercy than he had shown his wife. His death generated brief media attention, mostly articles reviewing the case and his conviction, but the coverage was perfunctory. The story had been told, the justice rendered, and Preston's death was simply the final administrative detail. Sarah felt nothing when she heard the news, not satisfaction, not grief, not even the grim closure that sometimes comes with a criminal's death. Preston had been removed from society, had spent his final years behind bars, and that was sufficient. His death neither added to nor subtracted from what he had done, but others felt differently. Iris Pemberton sent Sarah a card, a simple note that said only, "Thank you for letting me make it right before I go." Victoria Hargrove released a brief statement expressing satisfaction that her sister's killer had faced consequences. And Marcus Webb, the crew member who had heard Cordelia's scream, called Sarah to say that he had slept through the night for the first time in decades. The museum kept Cordelia's necklace on display, and visitors continued to come. The flowers kept appearing, the notes kept accumulating. Patricia Holloway expanded the exhibit, adding context about domestic violence and economic abuse, using Cordelia's story to illuminate broader issues that affected thousands of women who didn't have emerald necklaces or wealthy families or the ocean to preserve their testimony. The exhibit included a section on other cold cases that had been solved through persistence and technological advancement. It highlighted the importance of preserving evidence, of refusing to accept convenient explanations, of believing victims even when institutions tried to silence them. Cordelia's story became part of a larger narrative about justice and truth, and the ways both could be delayed but not ultimately denied. Sarah visited the exhibit on what would have been Cordelia's 78th birthday. The museum had organized a small memorial service, nothing formal, just an opportunity for people who had been touched by the story to gather and remember. Victoria Hargrove attended, now 85 and frail, but still carrying herself with dignity. Garrett Finch came, bringing his students, using the opportunity to teach them about how random discoveries could illuminate history. Marcus Webb was there too, standing quietly in the back, a man who had finally laid down his burden of silence. They stood together before the necklace, this diverse group united by connection to a woman most of them had never met. Patricia read a poem she had written, something about memory and the sea and the persistence of truth. Victoria shared stories about Cordelia as a child, about her sister's laughter and stubbornness, and refusal to accept injustice, even when fighting it came at personal cost. And Sarah, when asked to speak, talked about what the case had taught her about human nature and institutional failure, and the importance of never accepting the first explanation when evidence suggested something deeper lurked beneath. Cordelia couldn't save herself, Sarah said. The man who should have loved her killed her instead, and the institutions that should have pursued justice failed her. But she didn't let that be the end of her story. She left evidence. She recorded her truth. She trusted, despite having every reason for despair, that someone someday would care enough to look for what she had left behind. That trust, that hope, that final act of defiance against the man who thought he could erase her, that's what solved this case. Not my investigation, not forensic science, not the legal system. Cordelia solved her own murder. The gathering ended as the sun set over Whitehaven Point, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected off the harbor water. People departed slowly, reluctant to leave, as if remaining somehow kept Cordelia's presence alive a bit longer. Sarah stayed until the museum closed, standing alone before the necklace in the growing darkness. She thought about all the cases still waiting to be solved, all the voices still waiting to be heard, all the evidence slowly degrading in ocean depths, or buried in archives or hidden in plain sight, because no one had looked closely enough. The ocean never forgets, she thought, remembering the phrase that had begun this entire story. But forgetting isn't the same as telling. The ocean had kept Cordelia's secrets for 25 years, neither forgetting nor revealing, waiting with the patience of something that measures time in tides rather than heartbeats. But humans couldn't wait like the ocean. Humans needed closure, needed justice, needed the stories to end even when endings were complicated and imperfect. Sarah had given that closure to Cordelia, to her sister, to everyone who had carried fragments of this tragedy for decades. It wasn't perfect, justice never was, but it was enough. It had to be enough. As Sarah left the museum, she paused at the entrance and looked back one final time. The necklace caught the last rays of sunlight streaming through the window, the emerald burning with green fire, beautiful and terrible and eternal. She thought of Cordelia standing on the deck of the Meridian Dream that final night, wearing this necklace, recording her testimony, preparing for whatever came next with courage Sarah hoped she would never need to demonstrate. She thought of 25 years passing, of Preston growing old in freedom while his wife remained at the bottom of the sea. She thought of Garrett's hand reaching into the silt, closing around the necklace, pulling it into the light after a quarter-century of darkness. And she thought about how truth, like bodies in water, has its own buoyancy, how it rises when conditions are right, how justice delayed can still be justice served, even if the delay exacts a price none would choose to pay. The emerald necklace would remain in its case, behind glass, a reminder and a warning and a promise. It would remind people that victims can speak even from beyond death. It would warn that murderers might escape justice temporarily, but not eternally. And it would promise that someone, somewhere, would eventually care enough to dig deeper, to question the easy explanation, to bring truth into the light no matter how long darkness had prevailed. Sarah walked out into the evening air, leaving the museum behind but carrying its lessons forward. She had other cases waiting, other mysteries demanding attention, other voices waiting to be heard. Some would be solved quickly, others would take years or decades, some might never be solved at all. But she would keep looking, keep questioning, keep refusing to accept convenient lies when difficult truths lurked beneath the surface, because that's what Cordelia's story demanded. Not vengeance, not certainty, just the persistent application of attention and care to the places where justice had been denied. The ocean stretched before her, vast and dark and full of secrets it would never willingly tell. But Sarah understood now that the ocean didn't need to tell. It just needed to preserve. Humans would do the rest, would bring forward what needed to be known, would shine light into darkness, would transform silence into testimony. Cordelia Hargrove had trusted that someone would care. After 25 years, that trust had been vindicated. Her voice had been heard, her killer had been punished, her story had been told. And somewhere beneath the waves, in depths where sunlight never reached and pressure crushed everything human down to nothing, the ocean continued its eternal work of forgetting and remembering, of burying and preserving, of keeping secrets until the moment came to let them go. The moment had come for Cordelia. Her secret had been released, her voice had been restored, justice, delayed but not denied, had finally arrived. And that, Sarah thought as she drove away from the museum, heading toward whatever case waited next, was enough. It had to be enough. Because in a world where perfect justice was impossible, imperfect justice was still worth fighting for, still worth the years of patience and the persistence of hope, and the refusal to let victims disappear into convenient narratives that protected the powerful at the expense of truth. The necklace would remain, the story would continue to be told, and Cordelia Hargrove, silent for 25 years, would speak to everyone who stood before her memorial and listen to what she had trusted the ocean to preserve until the time came for her truth to surface.